whining and sulking and grumbling and woe is me and why that's not fair kind of attitudes going on in both the passage from Jonah and this gospel passage in Matthew. In preparing for this sermon, I came across a study conducted a few years ago on the evolution of fairness. Two researchers were interested in exploring where our perceived distaste for unfairness comes. Is it a cultural phenomenon, or is it just simply hardwired into us? To study this question, the two researchers did an experiment with capuchin monkeys, these cute little things. So two monkeys were placed in adjacent cages across from each other, and they were trained to take turns giving little rocks, little stones, to their human handlers. And each time the monkey gave a rock to the handler, they were given a piece of cucumber as a reward. Now, capuchin monkeys really like cucumbers, so this was very satisfactory to the monkeys. And they handed over their rocks with enthusiasm. But then, like any experiment, the handler changed it up a bit. And after a few fair exchanges, the handler gave the first monkey a piece of cucumber after he gave the rock to the handler. But then, the second monkey got a grape. You need to understand that grapes in the monkey world are like fine wine or really good chocolate, right? So seeing that the game had changed for the better, the first monkey was all excited and really eagerly gave up the stone to the handler. Of course, she was expecting, or the monkey was expecting, a grape, right? But she got a cucumber. Okay. To make things worse, the handler then gave the second monkey a grape for free. He didn't even have to hand over a rock. Now, the results were striking. You can actually look this up on YouTube. The first monkey just about lost her mind. She began banging on the cage, and then she threw the cucumbers in every direction. And she was making furious grimaces at the other monkey, the one who got the grapes. Now, scientists have also studied this in humans, in small babies as young as 9 months old. And even as young as that, they react quite strongly to anything that they perceive as unfair. Clearly, our concept of fairness is rooted deeply in our psyche. Now, we may not hurl cucumbers and bang on cages, but you know as well as I do that we all like to be treated fairly. We don't like it when we're not. It raises our hackles to witness someone else being treated fairly or getting something for nothing. We simply want what's coming to us. We want fairness. And when we perceive that we haven't been treated fairly or others haven't put in their dues, we moan and we groan and we sulk and we say, why, that's just not fair. So we can relate to Jonah's sulking and the hard-working laborers who have grumbled at the perceived unfairness of God in the Jonah story and the landowner in the gospel parable, which of course is meant to be God. Everyone is just looking for their fair share, to be treated fairly, at least fairly in our eyes, in the the human perception. It reminds me of Sally, Charlie Brown's little sister, in the classic Charlie Brown Christmas. I don't know if you can read this, but this is a classic line. She writes to Santa Claus and she says, "Dear Santa Claus, how have you been? Did you have a nice summer? How's your wife? I have been extra good this year, and I have a long list of presents that I want. Please note the size and color of each item and send as many as possible. If it seems too complicated, make it easy on yourself and just send money. How about 10s and 20s? So when Charlie Brown sees this letter, he can't believe Sally's greed, and this is what Sally says in response. All I want is my fair share. All I want is what's coming to me. Which takes us to the parable. Now, at the beginning of the parable, all seems fairly realistic. A landowner shows up at the local labor pool early in the morning, seeking help for his work in the vineyard. It's a scene which, prior to COVID, was repeated every morning around the world, as nearly every corner in the world would have laborers on it, with a landowner or someone coming, a farmer, whatever it is, seeking workers for that day's work. But this, of course, is a parable. And soon it takes our fixed, hardwired notions of what is fair and how the real world operates, and our attempts to make it obey our economic rules of fairness, and it stands them on their head. It makes all of that fall apart. Someone once said that whenever Jesus told a parable, he lit a stick of dynamite and covered it in a story. So before we talk about the parable and all the things that Jesus blows up in it, we need to set this parable in context, because it gives us insight about why Jesus delivers this particular parable at this point in time. Just prior to this, Peter asks Jesus what he and the other disciples could expect in the way of reward for their loyalty to Jesus. After all, they've given up everything to follow him. Peter points out, what will Jesus give them in return? In other words, we will be further up in that line in the kingdom of heaven, right, Jesus? Why, that's only fair. And then right after this parable, reinforcing just how difficult fairness or generosity is, James and John's mother has made a special case for her sons, asking that Jesus seat them on either side of him in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus' own disciples are jockeying for position. They want to make sure that they get what is fair. So do the mothers. Good seats, first dibs. It's only fair, you know. We've given up nearly 3 years of our lives. Surely we will be treated better. This parable is set between those two requests. And the dynamite begins to blow things apart. First, the first stick blows up the motive of the landowner. We always assume that the landowner needed more workers for his vineyard and thus kept going back to the marketplace. But that's not really what the parable says. Nothing at all is said about the needs of the landowner. What's highlighted is the needs of the workers. The landowner sees them standing in the marketplace doing nothing and says, "You also go to work." This gets underscored in the last time the landowner goes, the one when he goes at 5 o'clock. The landowner says to the laborers that are still standing around in the marketplace, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" When they reply, they aren't working because no one has chosen them, he says, "You also go into my vineyard." In our market-driven economy, everything is surrounded by the needs of the boss. But this story is pulled along by the needs of the workers and the sympathetic landowner. The second thing that gets blown up is the motive of the workers. Those hired first feel that they are in a position to bargain. So they negotiate with the landowner to receive a denarius. It's a fair market value for a day's wage. But as the day goes on, the negotiation disappears. The workers hired in the middle of the day, they just go to work on the assurance that they will be paid fairly. And then by the end of the day, they simply go to work at the summons of the landowner. Perhaps there's some desperation here at the end of the day, but the fact remains that the later wave of workers go into the vineyard not on a signed contract, but rather simply trusting the landowner. In the real world, we would see flashing red signs all over the place. We would insist on a signed contract with X dollars working for Y hours, and if we worked over that, we want overtime and double time if it's a holiday. It's only fair. Trust the boss? Not so much. The third stick of dynamite that gets blown up has to do with the economy of compensation. The parable enhances this drama by the workers being paid in reverse order of when they were hired. The workers hired last, having only worked for maybe an hour, they were paid first, and they received, as you know, a denarius, a whole day's wages. Now, you can only imagine the delight of those first workers. They are groveling. They are thinking, they naturally assumed that if these guys got a denarius, look how much more we are going to get because we worked all day. Boy, that's only fair. But when they just got one denarius, they are incensed. They started grumbling. It's not fair. If they were the monkeys, the cucumbers would be flying. And the landowner responded in effect, "Don't you dare accuse me of injustice. You dealt for a denarius, and that's what I gave you. You just got what you bargained for. No harm, no foul. Besides, if you want a world that operates on deals and bargains and bean counting and the rules of finances and fairness, you need to find another parable. In this parable, the whole thing moves according to generosity, and everybody gets enough." Now, certainly this parable is not a blueprint for labor practices or economic systems. Any company that paid workers the same wages for only 1 hour of work as for 8 hours of work would soon find no employees coming into work at 9 a.m. Even so, this parable helps to work our imagination in ways that have really profound implications for economic and restorative justice. It allows us, if even for a moment, into an alternate world, one that operates on generosity, not greed, not ambition, not competition. It allows us to experience a world in which those who stand ignored and idled and discarded by the rest of society are given great value by God, regardless of their circumstances. The parable discloses the generosity that flows from the very life of God. God doesn't seem fair in this parable, but if God isn't fair, there's a chance that you and I will get more than we deserve. If God is not fair, then there's always the chance that you and I will be counted in the kingdom, not because of who we are and what we have done, but because of who God is. God is not fair, but God is generous. Thanks be to our generous God, and may we strive to be more like the landowner.